In the Middle Ages, across Europe and beyond, castles rose as symbols of power and protection. These stone fortresses were not simply grand residences, they were carefully designed defensive strongholds. Built in an era of feuding lords, bandits, and rival armies, a castle's main purpose was to keep people and territory safe. It served as the seat of a local ruler or lord, a refuge for villagers in time of war, and an impregnable barrier against foes seeking to raid or conquer the land. After the fall of the Roman Empire, political power splintered into many small states and fiefdoms. Kings had limited control, and local nobles often took matters into their own hands. They built castles to secure their holdings and protect local villages and trade routes. Early forms of medieval fortifications included wooden palisades and earthwork ring forts, but these were vulnerable to attack. Starting around the 10th century, the need for better defense led to the rise of the motte and bailey castle. A motte was an artificial hill of earth, topped by a wooden tower or wooden keep. Below it lay the bailey, an enclosed courtyard for people, animals, and supplies. These could be built quickly using timber and soil, and indeed, they became widespread across Norman, French, and German lands. For instance, after William the Conqueror's victory in 1066, Norman knights sprang up motte and bailey castles across England, from the hills of Lancashire to the southern coast, in order to establish control over newly won territory. Yet wood was an unstable medium for fortress walls, susceptible to rot, fire, and decay. A torch thrown by a besieging soldier could engulf a wooden castle swiftly. As a result, by the 11th and 12th centuries, a great castle-building race took place across Europe as wealthy lords rebuilt their keeps, walls, and towers in stone. Stone castles like the Tower of London, built by 1100, or Château Gaillard on the Seine, combined grand appearance with deadly defence. The White Tower at London demonstrated Norman power. Its limestone walls over 10 feet thick and narrow arrow slits meant that only a determined army could hope to take it. By the 13th century, stone castles were found throughout Christendom, in England, France, Spain, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and even in the Crusader states of the Levant. Throughout the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, castle design continually evolved as offence and defence improved against each other. A small 9th century refuge might have looked nothing like a lavish 14th century royal fortress, but both shared the same goal: resist enemies as long as possible. Today, we see places like Harlech Castle in Wales or Hohenwerfen Castle in Austria, and can appreciate the craftsmanship of walls, towers, and gateworks designed to slow attackers. Each element of the castle, from moat to battlement, was a calculated answer to some battlefield threat. Medieval castles came in all sizes. A powerful count might raise a sprawling walled city, while a minor knight might occupy a single tower house. But every castle, no matter how modest, shared the same goal: to protect those inside. In peacetime, a castle was the lord's home and court. Great halls were built for feasting and justice, and chapels for prayer. But in war, even the kitchens and stables mattered. They would become stores of food or points of defense. By encompassing homes, offices, and armories within a single fortress, a castle was essentially a self-contained town under one lord, a place where every building served daily life and defense. For example, the Tower of London started as a single square keep around 1078, but over the next century it grew into a massive castle with 2 curtain walls and numerous towers encircling it. Another example is Windsor Castle. Begun soon after 1066, it was expanded again and again. By the late 1100s, it had a long wall with multiple towers overlooking the river valley below. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, the Crusader Knights built Crac des Chevaliers in Syria in the 12th century. This castle has multiple walled wards, each with towers and its own gates. Seen from afar, Crac des Chevaliers looks like a small city perched on a hill, and in fact, it could hold thousands inside its walls during a siege. Castles also served as symbols of a lord's power and right to rule. When a new noble seized land, one of his first acts was often to erect a castle to assert dominance. For example, after each conquest in Normandy and England, new castles would spring up to control towns and roads. Sometimes, Demolishing a rebel's castle was a way to punish them. If a lord rose against the king, his castle might be slighted or razed to prevent future rebellion. The very sight of a castle on the hill sent a message: this land is protected, and it belongs to me. Yet when the hammer of war fell, those same walls became the defenders of the people who once paid tolls to build them. Geographic placement and strategic foundations location was the first line of defense for a castle. Medieval builders hunted for sites where nature did some of the work. Atop on a hill, ridge, or crag meant that enemies could see the castle looming above long before reaching it. Attacking uphill under arrow fire was extremely difficult. For example, Windsor Castle in England stands on a low hill above the River Thames. From there, it dominates the surrounding area and forces invaders to fight uphill. Similarly, in the Pyrenees, the Cathar Castle of Montségur was built at the summit of a rocky mountain, reachable only by narrow trails. Such positions allowed even a small garrison to hold off much larger forces for a long time. Water also made a natural moat. Some castles were built on islands, like Loch Leven Castle in Scotland, surrounded by a lake with just one drawbridge. Others used rivers or oceans as barriers. Dover Castle, often called the Key to England, sits on a chalk cliff beside the English Channel, preventing easy sea landings. Along England's southern coast, castles were placed at the only safe ports. Meanwhile, Bodiam Castle in Sussex was deliberately surrounded by a water-filled moat linked to a nearby river, so any siege engine had to be set up across water. In parts of the Low Countries and Germany, castles stood in marshy ground or had multiple concentric moats, turning them into islands. Even a dry moat, essentially a deep trench, gave attackers one more obstacle. One of the grandest examples is Carcassonne in France, which sits atop a raised limestone plateau with a vast dry ditch carved around the lower wall. Attackers had to descend and climb this ditch under arrows before even reaching the main wall. Castles were often placed at key crossroads or passes. A castle at a river ford or mountain pass could control traffic and tolls. In Western Europe, many castles were built atop former Roman forts or at major road intersections. In Normandy and England, William the Conqueror's strategy involved placing castles along the new roads and borders he needed to control. In Scotland and Ireland, Norman lords built castles along trade routes and rivers. In Spain, border castles like the Alcazar of Segovia or the Alhambra in Granada stood on hills overlooking the frontiers of the Reconquista. The terrain defined each castle's role. Coastal castles defended ports and coasts. Inland castles held valleys and roads. Frontier castles guarded borders. In some regions, castles took advantage of utterly unique terrain. For instance, Mont Saint-Michel in France is built on a small rocky island in a tidal flat. At high tide, it is surrounded by water, and at low tide, a muddy expanse lies around it. Any approach was either by a single winding causeway or by the sea itself. Similarly, many Scottish castles appear impossibly perched on rocky peaks. Edinburgh Castle crowns a volcanic plug above the city, accessible only along a rocky ridge. Stirling Castle guarded a narrow gap between the highlands and lowlands of Scotland by sitting atop steep crags. In Switzerland, castles like Chillon or Bellinzona's trio of fortresses, Castelgrande, Montebello, and Sasso Corbaro, controlled passes through the Alps by occupying rock outcrops at key choke points. Elsewhere in Europe, castles often reused old Roman sites or high ground near ancient cities. The medieval fortress of Akershus in Norway sits on a peninsula guarding Oslo. The castle of the Teutonic Order at Malbork, Poland, was built on flat marshland, but the Mariental Vistula River and canals acted as a natural moat on three sides. In Spain, the Christian and Muslim kingdoms built castles on peaks all across the peninsula. The Alcazar of Segovia sits on an isolated rock above two river valleys. The Alhambra in Granada crowns a steep hill over the city. Even relatively flat areas were made defensive by digging deep ditches and erecting heavy timber or earth banks before building the stone wall. Besides using the natural landscape, medieval builders ensured strong foundations. Castles were built on solid ground whenever possible. If bedrock was near the surface, walls were laid directly on it to prevent undermining. Where the ground was softer, builders dug deep trenches and backfilled with rubble and stone to create an artificial base. Some castle walls were even physically integrated into cliffs. At the Alcazar of Segovia, the wall follows a rocky spur that falls steeply to a river below. In many castles, the inner ward, or inner bailey, sat on a slightly higher plateau than the outer ward, providing an additional height advantage. By shaping and choosing the site so carefully, builders made sure their stone defences had a rock-solid footing that attackers could not easily overturn. Defensive design of walls. A castle's curtain wall was its principal barrier against attack. These stone walls could be incredibly thick and high, turning the castle into a near-impenetrable box. In many medieval castles, the walls had an inner core of rubble and mortar, faced with carefully cut stone blocks. This method packed massive amounts of material into the wall while saving on finely dressed stone. As a result, many curtain walls were the thickness of a room, often 7 to 20 feet, 2 to 6 meters thick at the base. Their height was equally daunting. 20 to 30 feet, 6 to 9 meters was common, but some walls soared higher. For instance, the ancient stronghold of Carcassonne has walls over 60 feet, 18 meters, tall in places, and Framlingham Castle's ring is over 40 feet high. With climbing ladders far shorter than these walls, attackers could only hope to throw themselves against them with siege engines or dig under them, often with little success. Not only was a thick stone wall hard to break, it also provided defenders with a deadly advantage. Atop the walls were battlements or crenellations, a sawtooth pattern of raised merlons and gaps or crenels. An archer standing behind a merlon could rest his bow, lean out through a gap, fire, and duck back behind cover in an instant. This meant defenders could rain volleys of arrows and bolts down on attackers while risking very little return fire. In some castles, thin holes known as arrow loops or embrasures were cut into the wall face to serve crossbowmen. Each loop is narrow on the outside, widening to the interior, so a crossbowman could aim along a wide range without exposing himself to arrows from outside. From these loops or from behind the merlons, garrison archers picked off the besiegers day or night. The wall itself was often given additional protective features. Machicolations, projecting stone balconies with openings in the floor, allowed defenders to drop boiling water, heated sand, or rocks onto attackers at the base of the wall. If a permanent machicolation was not built, defenders would erect wooden hoardings, temporary wooden galleries on top of the walls with holes in the floor. Archers, crossbowmen, or even soldiers with pokers could then directly attack anyone clinging to the wall's foot. Legend often speaks of boiling oil, but that was actually rare and expensive. More likely hot sand, water, or even quicklime was used. Even a rain of heavy stones could easily smash the helmeted head of an unsuspecting soldier. Climbing up under such a hail of projectiles was near impossible. In short, the wall was not a passive barrier but an active platform for defense. Some curtain walls were also tall enough to include an upper floor behind the wall face. In these vaulted passages, defenders could move behind the battle platforms, distribute supplies or fire arrows through windows at attackers. High on the walls, stone towers punctuated the curtain at regular intervals. Often each tower had multiple levels, an underground chamber, sometimes used as storage or a prison, a ground-level firing room, and 1 or 2 upper levels for lookouts and additional archers. Each tower typically had arrow slits on all sides, allowing crossfire along the wall and covering the base of the tower itself. In many castles, corner towers were placed at the angle between walls to provide flanking fire along both walls, meeting at that corner. Beyond stone, some castles experimented with brick due to lack of stone. The Teutonic Knights built Marienburg Castle almost entirely of brick in the 13th century. Its walls, over 10 meters thick, still stand as proof that even brick could stop medieval artillery of the day. In southern Europe, volcanic rock was sometimes used. For example, Sicily's castles used local basalt. In the Baltic, wood was still used for palisades outside the main stone walls as a first line of defense. No matter the material, the emphasis was always on mass and strength. Defenders added even more layers. By the 13th and 14th centuries, some of the strongest castles used multiple concentric walls. In these designs, a second taller wall was built inside the first. For example, Caerphilly Castle in Wales, built in the 1200s, has two massive rings of stone, each with its own towers and gatehouse. Edward I's castles in Wales, such as Beaumaris and Harlech, took this idea further. They surrounded the inner fortress with an outer ring wall, and often added a moat too. In a concentric castle, an enemy who breached the outer wall would immediately face the inner wall's defenders, who commanded a higher position and fresh weapons. This castle-within-a-castle approach was so effective that very few concentric fortresses were ever taken by assault during the Middle Ages. Approaching these thick walls exposed attackers to another danger: mines and sappers. Digging under a wall to collapse it was slow and dangerous under fire. Defenders often dug listening tunnels to hear enemy diggers, and would countermine or drop rocks into holes to collapse them. In places like Crac des Chevaliers or Château Gaillard, the walls were just too thick and deep to easily tunnel. In summary, the curtain wall was a deadly obstacle, a towering stone barrier behind which every arrow slit, battlement and machicolation turned the wall into a lethal defensive machine. Gatehouses and layered entry points. No matter how thick the walls were, every castle had to let people in, and attackers knew exactly where to strike. This made the gatehouse the most heavily fortified part of a castle. Defenders turned it into a small maze of death traps and barriers. Most castle approaches began with a moat or ditch. In its simplest form, the moat was a deep trench. In many places, moats were filled with water from a river or stream. Crossing the moat required a bridge, often a drawbridge. This wooden bridge could be raised by chains and counterweights, cutting off the way like a dam. When raised, it formed a wide plank of wood bristling with spikes, preventing enemy entry. When lowered for travel, it allowed friendly traffic. But even then, guards could keep enemies at bay on the bridge itself. Even if enemies made it across, they would next face the gate passage. A sturdy wooden door was the first obstacle. Often, this door was actually two doors, a thick outer door and a smaller inner door. But behind these stood the portcullis. A portcullis is a heavy grille made of wood reinforced with iron bars. It hung above in slots in the stone ceiling and could be dropped in an instant, like a vertical shutter. Castles often had more than one. For example, the massive King's Gate at Caernarfon Castle in Wales had not one, but two drawbridges, followed by 5 massive oak doors and 6 portcullises in sequence. An attacking soldier might break through the first door, only to be sandwiched between 2 falling portcullises. He would then have to smash through another door and portcullis further inside, all the while under a hail of arrows. Inside the gate passage, ceilings were pierced with murder holes. From these round openings in the ceiling, defenders above could pour boiling water or hot sand onto anyone trapped below. They would also drop stones and beams straight down. This meant an enemy, even after breaching the door, still faced a deadly gauntlet in the gate chamber. Along the sides of the entranceway, narrow arrow slits allowed crossbowmen and archers to fire directly at anyone caught between the gates. Since the gate corridor was often narrow, a small force of defenders could hold it against dozens of attackers. In many castles, the passage was long and winding, sometimes turning sharply so attackers could not see an exit. It was a dark, confined space where defenders had all the advantage. Some passages were even grated at intervals, forming compartments where attackers could be isolated and dealt with one segment at a time. Examples of famous gatehouses illustrate the complexity. At Bodiam Castle in Sussex, 14th century, the double portcullis grooves are still visible in the stone walls of the gatehouse, showing where 2 grilles would have locked fast, one behind the other. Inside that entryway, defenders could hide behind merlons in the sides and pick off any 2 or 3 men who got through the first gate. Some castles had right-angle turns in the gate passage, so attackers could not see the next doorway until they rounded the corner. This prevented them from all rushing at once. Other castles had barbicans, outer courtyards, that channeled attackers along narrow passageways lined with arrow loops and murder holes. For example, the Krakow Barbican was a round outer tower with 5 firing galleries, built specifically to cover the city's main entrance. In many medieval fortresses, attackers would emerge from the gate passage into another exposed courtyard, only to find yet another gate ahead. Thus, one castle could have an outer gate a barbican or walled yard, a drawbridge and gatehouse, and finally an inner gate and portcullis, each layer bristling with defenders. By the late medieval period, gatehouses could become as tall as a normal tower, with 2 or 3 floors. Guard rooms, storage rooms, and even small chapels might be built above the gateway. The upper floors provided platforms for crossbows and for looking out over the approach. In wartime, all those floors were armed. Notably, during the long siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, the defenders held out for over 6 months, largely thanks to Kenilworth's complex defences, including a formidable gatehouse. While siege engines battered away outside, the multiple portcullises and doors kept the attackers from reaching the inner wall for a very long time. Even when battering rams finally broke through the outer door, the next door down the tunnel was still locked in place. In short, the gatehouse was a fortress inside a fortress. Each day of a siege, the castle defenders could throw boiling water or drop huge stones on anyone stuck in the gate passage. A single portcullis was a major barrier. 2 in series turned the gatehouse into an anvil that ground the attacking forces. No wonder medieval sieges often focused on trying to force the gate first, and why attackers tried to dig tunnels or use trebuchets if a direct entry seemed impossible. By layering moat, drawbridge, outer gate, portcullis, murder holes, and inner gate, castle designers forced enemies to overcome one obstacle at a time, each under concentrated fire. Towers, keeps, and interior organization towers, in all their shapes and sizes, were multi-purpose weapons on a castle. Rising above the curtain wall, towers provided wide vistas of the land. From a high tower, a single lookout could spot an army on the horizon, or even just a lone scout trying to approach unnoticed. Many castles had a round wall tower every few dozen yards, each one able to turn archers slightly differently, so that fields of fire overlapped. A crossbowman on one tower could shoot at any soldier clinging to the base of the next tower over, making blind sides virtually non-existent. In German castles and some others, a huge central tower called a Burgfried served a similar purpose. A tall, usually circular tower, with no external entry, only a raised door. Attackers could not storm it. It was solely for refuge and signalling. Famous Burgfrieds include the Tower of Nuremberg Castle and the Donjon of Andernach, built high above the Rhine. The heart of a castle was usually the keep, the largest tower or blockhouse, also called the donjon. This was the lord's last stronghold and private residence in one. Medieval keeps were built to be nearly impregnable. They had extremely thick walls, often more than 10 feet 3 meters at the base, and ground floors with minimal windows or doors. Many keeps had their entrance on the first floor, accessed by wooden stairs or a removable ladder. Below that floor, the ground level was little more than a storeroom with massive vaults. Above were the living quarters. The keep's interior rooms were stacked vertically. The great hall and chapel on one floor, private chambers above, and storage or prison chambers below. Staircases inside the keep tended to be narrow and spiral, usually winding clockwise as they ascended. This design gave an advantage to defenders descending the stairs, as they had more room to swing a weapon with their right hand, while attackers moving up found their swing limited by the central column. Atop the keep might sit a small fighting platform or watchtower. From there, defenders could rain arrows in all directions. Just climbing the keep itself was difficult. Invaders who scaled an inner courtyard wall to reach the base of the keep would find themselves under fire from the top as soon as they appeared. The keep's height and strong walls meant that once inside it, defenders could hold out for an extremely long time. Historical sieges often ended in negotiations long before attackers could actually capture the keep. Towers along the curtain wall and within baileys served multiple roles. Many had a low square base for storage or living, with an upper story for archers. If a section of outer wall was lost, defenders could retreat into a tower's upper floors and continue firing down. For example, the round towers of Conwy Castle in Wales were 2 stories high, with an arrow loop on the first floor and a second loop above. This allowed archers to shift fire from one level to the next as needed. Some towers had their own chamber to hold water or food, so a small garrison could last even if cut off from the rest of the castle. Inside the castle's outer walls and keep were organized spaces for all the functions of life, all with defense in mind. The courtyards, baileys inside the walls, contained the buildings for daily life. Common structures in the inner ward included the Great Hall, kitchens, barracks, stables, storehouses, and workshops. The Great Hall of the castle was a high-ceilinged room where the lord would dine, hold court, and host knights. It might stand in an annex of the keep or as a separate building. Kitchens, with open hearths and large ovens, were often placed in the outer bailey for safety, though not all castles could do this. Some had kitchens built into the walls or on the castle's periphery. Food stores like granaries or wine cellars were built against the walls or in towers. Often the ground floors of towers served as cool, secure storage. Barracks for soldiers and servants were usually simple timber buildings or lean-tos along the walls if space was limited. Castles were stocked for endurance. For example, large stone wells or cisterns ensured water inside the walls. Many keeps had deep wells dug into bedrock. Even a long siege would not cut off drinking water. Indeed, historical sieges sometimes turned on who controlled the water. A castle well could not be poisoned from outside, making it a lifeline. Food storage was crucial. A castle's fields and livestock around the walls might be eaten in weeks, so granaries often held enough grain for months. Cooks could bake bread and store it. Guards rationed carefully. During the siege of Kenilworth in 1266, the defenders held out through the winter by rationing their granary and turning their remaining food into broth and biscuits. Secret and hidden features were also woven into the interior. Many castles had postern gates, small, concealed doors, that led out through the outer walls. Defenders could use these to sally forth at night or send messages out. For example, Beaumaris Castle had a sally port angled toward the sea, allowing defenders to slip out by boat if needed. Hidden storage rooms and false floors were built to hide valuables or even trap intruders. Some castles had concealed passageways within walls or towers. In many larger castles, tunnels connected different wards. For instance, the Tower of London has an internal postern that allowed the royalty to escape to the river if the city fell, though that is an example of later adaptation. These features meant that the defenders always had a plan if part of the castle fell. They could regroup or resupply from hidden routes. While soldiers manned the walls, non-combatants had roles too. Women and older men helped bolster defenses by hauling stones and water to the ramparts. Children might hold spare arrows or run messages. The siege of a castle was often a community effort within its walls. Even the chapel had a practical role. Archers took cover in the stone buttresses, and roof timbers might be dismounted to strengthen walls. Thus, when the walls held firm and an enemy finally withdrew, the inhabitants emerged wary but intact, in large part thanks to the thoughtful organization of their castle's interior. Through all these features, from high vantage points to hidden murder holes, the medieval castle was layered in defense. Each step inward meant stepping into another trap or defended zone, slowing attackers to a crawl. In the end, a castle could rarely be taken by a quick charge. It was a siege of attrition against unyielding stone and steadfast defenders. For now, the castle stands unbroken, its walls tested but unmoved, and its defenders unbowed. Countermeasures against siege engines. When an attacking army arrived with massive siege engines, the castle's defenders sprang into action. Battering rams thudded against the stout gates, but soldiers at the entrance quickly braced heavy logs and chains behind the portal. An inner portcullis would drop in an instant if the wooden door cracked. From murder holes and arrow slits above, archers fired at the ram's crew, while others poured boiling oil or heated sand through the grates. Defenders even used cranes and grappling hooks to yank on the ram's frame, trying to knock it off its path. Every inch of wood in the ram's shed was under a rain of arrows. Siege towers presented a special problem. These great wooden machines, often covered in wet hides against fire, allowed armed soldiers to climb up and pour onto the walls. Castles countered towers in several ways. Many fortresses were surrounded by wide moats or deep ditches, so a tower stalling at water or mud bought precious time. Attackers had to build causeways or platforms to bridge the moat, a slow task done under a storm of arrows from above. On dry ground, the approach might be littered with hidden pits and long iron spikes, caltrops, to maim horses and slow marchers. Once a tower did reach the wall, defenders unleashed burning arrows and logs to set it ablaze. Soldiers on the wall also swung axes or hurled stones at its base, aiming to collapse it. A tower that began to burn or listed would be abandoned by its crew. In one famous account, the defenders even trained their ballistae on an advancing tower and shot it full of holes before it could be fully brought up. Stone-throwing machines like catapults and trebuchets could relentlessly bombard a castle for days. The defenders' response was repair and counter-fire. Every time a boulder smashed into a wall, masons and labourers rushed forward to pack earth, rubble and sand into the damaged section, cushioning the blow. If a wall or tower was punctured, the garrison stuffed the gap with barrels, logs and earth to hold it shut. Inside the gate and keep, piles of sandbags or timber cradled the stonework as extra shock absorbers. Meanwhile, the defenders launched their own missiles. Smaller catapults and large crossbows on the curtain walls hurled iron bolts and rocks back at the enemy engines. They aimed not just at crumbling walls, but even at the operators of the trebuchets. In one 13th century siege, the defenders' catapult outranged the attackers. Its flying stones smashed into the besiegers' camp, driving them off momentarily. When cannon came centuries later, a similar duel of artillery took over. Mining under the walls was another deadly threat. Enemy sappers would tunnel beneath a tower's foundation, prop it with timber supports, then set those supports on fire. In the ensuing collapse, tons of stone would fall. Castle defenders grew very adept at listening for such tactics. Men stationed on the ground pressed their ears to wooden posts or held a bowl of water to detect vibrations or bubbles from distant digging. When they suspected a mine, engineers quickly dug a countermine, a secret tunnel driven downward and then sideways to meet the attacker's tunnel. If the enemy broke through underground, the two sides might fight in darkness with torches, swords and picks. Failing to intercept, defenders sometimes broke into the attacker's mine and collapsed it from behind, burying their own tunnel so neither side could emerge there. In some cases, they even flooded the enemy's shaft by breaking into a cistern or stream, turning the rockwork into a flooded trap. A carefully bored listening well and counter-tunnel could foil even the cleverest sappers. Above all, height and sheer mass were passive defences. Many castles built wooden hoardings or projecting brattices along the wall tops. These covered balconies let archers and crossbowmen shoot straight down at any foes gathered at the base. From these overhangs, soldiers hurled heavy stones, snatched up boiling oil or sand, and threw beams onto scaling ladders or gathered rams below. A single bucket of hot liquid dropped from a battlement could break the momentum of an entire assault. Even inside the gatehouse, the architecture fought for the defenders. Attackers who entered found themselves under crossfire through narrow murder holes or bent corridors. A pitched walkway or crooked entrance could funnel them into a small pocket surrounded by walls. When a portcullis or inner gate fell shut, the intruders might suddenly find themselves trapped and exposed to arrow fire from all sides. In every way, double gates, thick doors, overlapping defences, the castle bought time and made every approach a killing zone for the operators on the walls. Life under siege. When the castle gates clanged shut, daily life inside changed completely. Soldiers and knights still held the walls, but outside the fight, everyone found a task. Noblewomen and other residents fetched water from the deep well or stored cisterns, carrying bucket after bucket to keep cooking fires burning and any wounds cleaned. Children ran messages between soldiers and collected firewood or herb gardens. Craftsmen and peasants were pressed into support work. Blacksmiths repaired and sharpened swords and arrowheads. Carpenters fortified doors and patched the roof. Seamstresses sewed mail and stitched rips in the cavalry's surcoats. Even monks, stable boys and guests who had sought refuge helped mend broken helmets, fetch dirty dishes or butcher emergency meat. No matter their rank, everyone pitched in to multiply the castle's strength. Food became a daily obsession. Castles usually stocked provisions for emergencies: barrels of salted pork and beef, dried peas, hard biscuits and beans. And at the start of a siege, the quartermaster took meticulous inventory. In the first days, the lord might even order a feast to bolster morale, but fresh meat and vegetables soon disappeared. Rationing began with careful calculation. Bread loaves and grains were divided into the smallest portions. In one 14th century account, a steward recorded that his 1,000 men were each given barely 2 slices of rye bread per day and a handful of salted pork per week. Men turned to any available protein: hunting eels from the moat, feeding kitchen scraps to pigs fattened for slaughter. By a siege's end, grim choices were made. Horses once used in battle might be butchered as food. The strongest were saved last. One chronicle notes that even war horses were slaughtered only after every pig and cow had gone. Water was conserved fiercely. Every drop of collected rainwater and every bucket drawn was measured. If a castle had a hidden spring in the keep, that was rationed like gold. Maintaining morale was as important as managing stores. The castle commander acted as both general and counsellor. He organised daily routines to keep people busy, repairing breaches, training young archers, or even staging mock drills, so that idle fear had no room to grow. In the courtyard and halls, men played dice or strategy games quietly during the long days, a small relief to minds on the brink. Each morning, a herald might proclaim the date of a feast day or saint's day, and even lighting candles in the chapel or hearing mass gave hope that a higher power watched over them. News from outside, a reported sighting of friendly troops on the way, became a treasured rumour passed around eagerly, bolstering each heart. Trumpets and drums still sounded at dawn, a defiant fanfare to show the castle was still armed and ready. Even in bed at night, guards tried to shut out the moans of the wounded by singing old marches or lullabies of home. Every small sign of defiance, the flag still flying at the gate, a cheer from the battlements as a catapult fell, reminded the defenders that they had not broken. Sanitation and sickness tested the inhabitants sorely. With hundreds jammed into barracks and chambers, latrines soon overflowed and refuse piles grew. Chamber pots were emptied onto the moat banks and sometimes frozen in place in winter, making tending them a misery. In this cramped environment, lice and fleas were rampant, and worse, disease crept through ranks. Dysentery, typhus, and fevers spread unchecked in the crowded alleys and stables. Medieval doctors could offer only herbs, broths, and prayer. One siege chronicle grimly notes that more men often died of sickness and exhaustion within the walls than were slain by the enemy's swords. Still, the survivors refused to despair openly. Planks were set around death pits to keep others away, and the sick or dying were quietly tended in the chapel or cellar. Even as men with hot, bandaged heads sat and shivered, their comrades lifted them onto stretchers and carried them to safety. It was a bitter reality that, to last longer, they had to endure this suffering without losing courage. Despite the hunger, fear, and stench, a grudging camaraderie often emerged. Sharing scarcity forged unity. Soldiers would quietly divide up one loaf so that the faintest got half as much as a strong man. When one war party succeeded in destroying a siege tower's support, a cheer would ripple through the defenders, giving everyone a burst of hope. Women and children gave comfort too. An old woman with a pot of hot soup would thank a weary archer, and mothers soothed frightened children together at night with soft songs. In the evenings, by dim candlelight, survivors huddled and told stories of past victories, how their fathers held out at a siege, or how saints had once saved a city, to remind themselves that relief might come. Every repaired buckler and patched arrow was a small victory shouted about. Every bucket of water drawn at sunrise a quiet triumph. Working side by side, hauling a heavy timber, lowering a faulty ladder, hauling a wounded man off the gate, built a sense that they would not break alone. Even as doorposts groaned and moats whispered cold, the community inside the walls drew strength from itself. Tactics used by defenders. Defenders did not simply sit behind walls in silence. They often took the fight to the besiegers. Hidden postern gates and sally ports allowed small forces to slip out unexpectedly. A detachment of knights and crossbowmen might emerge under the cover of darkness or sudden storm. In one recorded siege, 50 men crept out at nightfall to burn the enemy's piled timber and battering ram. In another, archers stealthily unfastened ropes on a siege tower in the fog, causing it to collapse into the mud. Each daring sortie, even of a few men, disrupted the attacker's rhythm. It forced the besiegers to pull back and guard their engines, buying the defenders precious hours or days. Word spread quickly through the walls. Even the smallest success lifted hearts and reminded both sides that this fight was far from over. Outside the walls, the defenders set traps and obstacles at every likely approach. The field before a castle often became a perilous minefield. Defenders buried sharpened stakes in shallow pits and covered them with brush so that a charging knight or infantryman would impale himself without warning. Iron caltrops, 4-spiked metal blocks, were scattered across the ground to cripple horses and bare feet alike. On slippery slopes leading up to the keep, molten grease or oil might be poured at night to foil ladders or cause horses to slip. Within the gatehouse, the design itself was a trap. Attackers who rushed in often found themselves funneled into crooked passages. As soon as an outer gate fell, they were exposed to arrows from hidden slits on the sides and above. One could imagine unsuspecting soldiers trapped in an L-shaped corridor, under fire from 3 directions with no clear way out, except back through the portcullis behind them. In effect, every incursion became a killing box if defenders knew how to seal it. Deception also became a key part of the defense. A small garrison could make itself seem large and well supplied. Spare helmets or straw effigies might be placed on the battlements, and dozens of extra torches lit at night, so that the enemy believed every tower was manned. Defenders sometimes whispered false intelligence to the attackers. A captured messenger, for instance, might be coerced to carry a forged letter, claiming a huge relief army was only a day away. Even mundane acts were used as tricks. One commander ordered barrels to be rolled around in circles on the walls, hinting at ever-spinning supplies. In one saga, defenders arranged a fake council debate in full view, making it seem they considered surrendering, only to later publicize that they had rejected harsh terms, encouraging fear that still more men remained inside. The goal was always to make the enemy hesitate or spread discord among their own ranks. Psychological warfare was woven through the defense. Defenders exploited fear and surprise whenever possible. They flung burning tar or dead animals toward the attackers, hoping the stench would break the soldiers' will. In some sieges, they even fired contorted corpses or waste, not only to repel the assault, but to sow terror of disease. Bold noises were made on the walls to give illusion of forces. Once, besiegers reported hearing triumphant drums and singing, making them think a relief force had arrived and prompting them to double their guard. Taunts and bold proclamations often flew from the ramparts. "No man alive will enter this place," they would shout. A rattling volley of arrows with a yell could make soldiers dive for cover and rethink the attack. In one account, defenders slammed their shields or beat on hidden drums at midnight, sending off a column of surprised enemy scouts. Each mind game was meant to wear the enemy's nerve down. After all, a frightened army loses its cohesion faster than one battered by stones. Final holds and surrender. Despite every measure, sometimes the walls would finally give way, or starvation would force a desperate move. Castles had plans for this too, a withdrawal into the keep. The keep was the last redoubt, often a massive tower at the heart of the castle. Long before the siege, defenders stowed extra casks of water, cheeses, and salted meat deep in the keep's vaulted cellars. They piled furniture and earth to barricade the inner gates. When outer defences fell, the remaining knights, soldiers, and civilians would retreat to this final stronghold, ready to fight it out on far smaller terms. In the keep, they fought with everything left. Short bows from high loops, narrow murder holes spitting boiling liquids, and every arrow in the quiver. Just as in the yard, even the act of hurling rocks straight down had been planned by cunning architecture. If the situation truly became hopeless, the garrison eventually turned to negotiation. Chivalric custom often allowed it. A truce under a white flag let negotiators come and go. Typically, the defenders, now few and worn, would be allowed to leave with honours of war rather than be slaughtered. Common terms were surprisingly lenient. The survivors, even if only a handful of knights and exhausted soldiers remained, could march out with arms and horses. A famous example was Kenilworth Castle in 1266. After 172 days, the rebels inside, reduced by disease to a fraction of their numbers, were finally granted safe conduct. They walked out fully armed on their horses, with as much armour as each man could carry, a sign of respect for their stubborn resistance. Often, the lord of the castle was allowed to demand hostages or a ransom for safe passage, which was seen as a civilized end to a grim ordeal. In some sieges, townsfolk even negotiated rights to seek mercy for their families. Even at the very end, there could be cunning. A commander might pretend to parley while secretly slipping letters through hidden channels, or he might quietly remove secret stores as the guards lined up the defenders to march. By the agreed surrender hour, the last wounded were sometimes carried out so that the terms could be fulfilled without actually opening every door. If the attackers agreed to wait until, say, noon to enter, some garrisons used those hours to burn unfinished battle preparations or to sneak messengers to allies. But once the final terms were accepted, usually the defenders opened the gates at dawn with as much honor as they could muster. They filed out in formation, each knight carrying his standard and each sergeant his shield, accepting their fate rather than letting it become a massacre. Negotiation did not end a siege peacefully every time, but it often saved lives on both sides when courage had become too dear a price. The decline of castles. By the late 15th century, the era of the medieval castle's martial dominance was waning. The chief reason was gunpowder artillery. Early cannons and bombards, once experimental weapons, became powerful siege engines. Castle walls that had once shrugged off trebuchet stones could now crumble under cannon fire. History made the change starkly clear. In 1453, Ottoman heavy guns shattered the once mighty walls of Constantinople, proving that even the grandest fortifications could fall. Across Europe, armies took notice. Instead of building ever taller walls, engineers began building ramparts of earth and low-profile forts. The response was a revolution in fortification. Square, vertical keeps gave way to sprawling star-shaped forts designed to deflect cannonballs. Moats, curtain walls and bastions remained, but they were placed lower and made thicker with packed earth. In France and Italy, entire cities built those angled bastions, the tres italiennes, that dominated Renaissance warfare. England's early modern King Henry VIII even adapted his coastal castles. He lowered curtain walls, widened walls into platforms, and installed gun decks. Castles still stood, but their design was changing to face a new world. Once the drawbridge was raised, invaders might now face not only stone walls but gun ports and angled earthen glacis. Medieval towers became obsolete overnight. Political shifts sealed the castle's fate. Powerful centralized states emerged, reducing the need for private strongholds. During the late Middle Ages, many independent lords found their castles taken or dismantled by their king. A noble castle seen as a threat to royal authority would often be slighted, deliberately ruined, to ensure it could not be used in rebellion. When England and Scotland unified their crowns, some border castles were abandoned or converted into garrisons. During the Tudor reign in England, the King's surveys ordered the demolition of ill-needed fortresses, even as the strongest castles were turned into opulent palaces, with defences adjusted for cannon. Kings no longer relied on stone walls to control the land. They relied on large, mobile armies and navies. A lone stone fortress without modern firepower and an army to resupply it became less valuable. Despite these changes, the legacy of castles lived on. The layered defensive principles carried into later fortresses, even if the shape changed. Vauban and other star fort designers still employed moats, outerworks, and crossfire fields, concepts born of the castle age. The very concept of a citadel, an inner keep of last resort, persisted in military thought. Culturally, castles remained symbols of strength. Even in ruin, each turret and curtain wall reminds us of an age when a sturdy fortress meant security. Many later strongholds copied castle names and features, showing that the image of the fortress had become deeply rooted. The word castle itself entered our vocabulary as shorthand for any powerful defense. Though built for bows and boiling oil, their lessons carried forward into the age of cannons and beyond. Conclusion. Medieval castles were more than buildings. They were lifelines for those who defended them. In the long chapters of siege warfare, the castle stood as a stage for human will. Defenders confronted every machine of war with ingenuity. An arrow against steel, a chainsaw, chains and grit against oak. Communities within those walls shared bread by candlelight and struggled through the hell of siege together. They refused to cower, climbing tower steps with firepots in hand and standing firm on cold, starry nights. Even common peasant and gentle knight became allies under those stones. Though the thunder of the cannon ultimately ended the age of high walls, the legacy of castle defense endures. Later fortresses adopted the castle's multi-layered approach to defense, and historians have learned much by studying medieval sieges. Castles left an imprint on military engineering and on our culture of courage. Every ruined keep on a hill reminds us that there was a time when stone and spirit alike formed an unyielding shield. Today, as we gaze upon castle ruins, we remember that in medieval warfare, no stone was ever passive. Each one was a piece of a grand, human-made stronghold. The stories of those castles and their defenders still inspire, showing us how grit and strategy can turn even cold rock into an invincible fortress of hope.